I've come across a reasonable variety of geniuses while going through stories. From evil masterminds, to mad scientists, to quiet bookworms, and so on and so forth. While all being very different for the most part, they all seem to share one characteristic. They all have ambition, or at very least a drive to achieve something notable. I guess generally a genius isn't all that interesting unless they're applying their genius to something. The genius in the story I'll be reviewing today, however, has no great drive. He's as lazy as he can manage, and his great goal is to become a librarian in a seldom used library, and lays away the rest of his days with books and women. Sadly for him, and luckily for us, said genius ends up in the military through happenstance. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Tenkyou no Alderamin. Tenkyou no Alderamin is set in the Kachavarna Empire, whose climate and geography seems pretty similar to India, and tech-wise is comparable to Napoleonic Europe. Everyone in this fantasy world seems to have little elemental spirits bound to them as our token fantasy element. These spirits aren't really touched on all that much, as while they can speak, you scarcely ever hear them do so, and mainly they're just there to be used as a replacement for technology. Wind spirits can be used to create compressed air to fire guns instead of using gunpowder. Water spirits can generate ice for refrigeration, and so on and so forth. In this story, we follow a group of military cadets as they progress through the ranks of the Kachavarna Empire's military. Interestingly, the Kachavarna Empire doesn't necessarily have the most wise or benevolent leadership, so often enemies to the Empire from the outside aren't necessarily the only enemies these cadets have to deal with. This story is full not only of military campaigns, but also politics, intrigue, and seduction. Our protagonist, Ikta, is the lazy genius I mentioned in the introduction to this review. He's a complete smartass, whose hobbies include showing up his superiors, seducing ladies, and skipping out on anything that remotely resembles work, unless it'll save him a greater amount of work further down the line. He can be remarkably sincere though when it comes to science, or logical thinking, a concept he's trying to spread in the kingdom that's dominated by theology and religious dogma. Along with Ikta, we have his 5 friends in the military. Yatori, a Mirisu who has godlike fighting skills and intelligence that almost rivals Ikta's. Torway, a calm, sensitive, kind Bishonen and a god-given gift to fangirls. Camille, the royal tsundere, princess of the Kachavarna Empire. Haroma, a cute medic, the shy and clumsy type. And Matthew, the only regular guy among the bunch, with a bit of extra fat, a healthy sense of fear, and an ego that gets bruised a lot. This cast is small enough that we get to see a fair bit of all of them, and it's not uncommon for the story to switch perspectives to follow someone other than Ikta. In Alderamin, while it's quite obvious that our protagonists are good people, it's not necessarily obvious that they're on the right side of the conflicts they're involved in. The Kachavarna Empire is not the nicest of places, and I often found that I'm much more sympathetic towards their enemies than I am towards them. This creates a nice amount of moral ambiguity in the story that makes it much more interesting to read than a simple tale of good versus evil. I also really appreciate that this story places a lot of emphasis on strategy and tactics, with power coming from your ability to command your troops and outthink your foes. While this kind of focus is not uncommon in science fiction or historical fiction, in fantasy stories, it's all too common for there to be a couple chosen one characters who are so supremely powerful that regular troops become obsolete. While watching superhumans bash away at each other with epic powers can be amusing and all, I really enjoy watching large-scale conflicts unfold where the grunts are actually relevant, and who your commander is more important than just having a couple supremely talented fighters. Lastly, I have to comment that I really like Ikta. His snarky comments and general attitude are genuinely entertaining, and he's actually a competent pervert. Unlike what you get from the protagonist of an ecchi series, Ikta doesn't derp around, accidentally grabbing boobs, staring at panties, and walking in on girls changing, all the while never getting laid. Rather, he's fairly successful at seducing women, and does so in a way that doesn't waste a lot of the reader's time. If you're going to write a character that worships the female form, this is the way to do it. As weird as it sounds, my biggest problem with this story is the suspension of disbelief required whenever Ikta gets punished for his insubordination. given some of the stunts he's pulled without punishment, like, assaulting a general and threatening to strangle a princess, it's quite frankly amazing that he hasn't got court-martialed, thrown out of the military, and possibly even executed. The leniency of this world's armed forces often beggars belief. On the flip side, Ikta also gets thrown in jail without food or water for 6 days for skipping a military drill. Humans generally die after about 3 days without water, so this means he essentially received a death sentence for a fairly minor infraction. Now, Ikta somehow survived and rapidly recovered because of main character powers, but the severity of the punishment in this case seems just as ridiculous as the lack of punishment earlier. It becomes just a bit harder to take this story seriously when skipping military drills is treated more harshly than threatening the life of a member of the royal family. Another issue I have with this story is that although Ikta is supposed to be all scientific-minded and logical, his statements contradict this portrayal. One prominent example of this is his use of the gambler's fallacy to explain why his accuracy at target practice would surely improve. The way it is written suggests that the writer himself is unaware of what the gambler's fallacy is, and incidents like this really hurt my immersion in this book. My last complaint would be that other than Ikta, I can't really say I got particularly attached to any of the characters. They're not terribly written or anything, but none of them have really turned into anything interesting. Given how much time they've got in the story, I would have liked to see them developed a bit more. Tenkyou no Alderamin is a story that's heavy on strategy and plotting and low on epic individual fights. As a result, it's a refreshing change compared to most of the other fantasy stories I've read recently. While I do have some issues with the consistency of writing, I enjoyed this series and can give it a solid recommendation to read. If you've already read Tenkyou no Alderamin and are looking for something similar to read, I'm going to actually recommend something from outside of Japan, a little western novel by the name of Ender's Game. While I know some people are none too happy with the author of that story for his homophobic remarks, the story itself is good, and Alderamin often reminded me of Ender's Game as I was reading it, with its similar focus on military tactics and leadership. Anyways, that concludes my review. Thanks for listening. Cheers!